So the idea for this video came from watching a podcast called Dad Saves America with a guest called, I think her name was Erica Komisar, a psychotherapist stroke psychoanalyst. And the title of the particular clip that interested me was called something like How Attachment Has a Long-Term Effect on the Mental Health of Your Kids, or something like that. Now, the attachment that she's referring to in this video is that of attachment theory. So attachment theory in psychology is a post-Freudian, in other words, a Freudian, a later Freudian, if you like, theory that postulates that the attachment that's formed with the primary caregiver in the first few years of life is paramount. Specifically, it was originally formulated by John Bowlby, who was a psychiatrist in the 50s, affiliated with the now notorious Tavistock Clinic that was at the centre of that transitioning scandal a couple of years ago. Hampstead in North London is the epicentre of psychoanalysis, really, always has been. And John Bowlby was based there, and his theory was that mammalian infants and toddlers, very young humans and other animals like elephants and so on, the child forms a secure attachment, preferably with a primary caregiver, usually the mother. And it's what he called a secure base. So a non-human example of that would be a mischievous baby elephant runs out from underneath its mother's legs, scares a flock of birds, then encounters a slightly larger animal and runs back scared to its mother and hides under its mother's legs again. The classic human child behavior would be running along, falls over, bruises his or her knee, runs back to mum. So that idea that there's a primary secure base for the child, and that's quite sensible in evolutionary terms. You could see how that would develop to, that would be useful to not be predated on, right? You wouldn't stray too far down the branch, you'd stay near mum, kind of thing. So a sensible idea initially that has gotten completely out of whack. So what it tends to mean these days, attachment theory has become synonymous with the childhood trauma movement, what's known as the first 3 years movement. The idea that if there's anything wrong with that secure attachment in the first 3 years, you will suffer effectively brain damage, and your brain will not wire up properly. I think the central claim that Komisar made in that video was something like, at 2 critical periods in human growth, the first 3 years, and then again, funnily enough, in teenage years, when I would suggest young people are the least influenced by their parents, she claimed that parents were the primary architect of their child's brain during those critical periods. When she says critical periods, she's alluding to neurological critical windows of growth, whereby cells grow and are then later pruned away. This idea was popularized in Norman Doidge's book, which was called The Brain That Heals Itself, which is about brain plasticity. So in recent years, this neo-psychoanalytic movement, which is what it is, a neo-Freudian movement, has kind of borrowed concepts like epigenetics and neural plasticity and inappropriately tagged them on to its Freudian psychoanalytic theories. And one of these is that if the neurogenesis, the birth of cells and the connections of brain cells and neural networks in the first 3 years of life is not solidified via the vehicle of motherly love, effectively, or primary caregiver love, then the person will become broken and damaged to some degree in a way that's relatively, in fact significantly, permanent. Even if good things happen after the first 3 years, that lack of attachment to the primary caregiver in the first 3 years of life will cause what's called attachment disorder, which can and does, according to them, manifest as an adult in mental illness, emotional problems, addictions, things like that. There's no real evidence for this at all. It is absolute nonsense. And the way to prove that, we don't need any studies. We can do a simple logical exercise that literally anybody can understand. Okay, so the problem with this theory, as Jerome Kagan, a prominent psychologist, pointed out, is let's spin it the other way around. If the effects of secure attachment or insecure attachment in infancy, the first 3 years, are indelible to the point where you will need psychotherapy later to treat this attachment disorder that is a historical legacy of your poor upbringing in the first few years of life. If we just flipped that and said, what if you had a secure attachment for those years, and in which case presumably your neurological development was very good, and then something catastrophic happens. One of your caregivers, say your dad, your wonderful dad, dies, and your mother, perhaps for reasons of grief or otherwise, marries a sadistic and cruel stepfather, then obviously you're in trouble by the time you're 14. 10 years of abuse, you are not inured to 10 years of horror because you had a good first 3 years. So if it's true that way round, then obviously it's true the other way round. What happened to you in your first 3 years of life is largely irrelevant if very different things occur later. So the same thing could be true for somebody who had a bad start. Their mother had postnatal depression, which is often quoted as a cause of attachment disorder, and adulthood addictions and so on later. That is untrue. If your mother could suffer postnatal depression, you could have a relatively adverse environment for the first 3 years. If it gets better thereafter, you'll have no memory of that, and no neurological or emotional or psychological legacy of it. It will just be irrelevant, obviously, for the simple and obvious reason that things that you can't remember don't traumatize you, obviously, right? So, for example, let's suggest I go out for the night and I get blackout drunk, and that night a vicious gang accost me and put guns in my face and knives to my throat, but the next morning I don't remember anything about it. I don't have any traumatic symptoms, nothing, because I can't remember it. Conversely, if I was stone cold sober, then obviously I may well have, that may well have a significant psychological impact if I really thought I was going to die, right? Other interesting examples would be what we'd call wet brain, what now we'd call Korsakoff syndrome, which is a dementing illness that advanced alcoholics have, where they forget everything, or specific pieces of information get blanked out. So they'll often remember one thing and another thing, but can't remember what happened in between. So what they'll do is they'll confabulate and invent a story to connect the two things to help it make sense, right? Well, those guys sometimes forget that they're alcoholics, right? They can't remember to drink because they've got a dementing illness that affects their memory. And so somebody has to give them either some alcohol or some benzodiazepine like Librium to stop them going into a seizure. So what we can't remember often certainly won't affect us in terms of trauma, which of course is antithesis to this movement. The attachment theory movement is synonymous with the childhood trauma movement, and the movement which is based in Freud's centuries-old theory that adult psychopathology arises from hidden trauma in early childhood, which it just doesn't. If the trauma is hidden and unconscious, it can't be exerting an effect. But that school of thought would say, yes, it does. It exerts an effect through the body somehow. That those things somehow get stored by the nervous system. We still don't know how, apart from some sort of vague, woolly pseudoscience studies that purport to prove it. But nothing that any sensible person would recognize, right? That somehow things that we don't remember that were traumatic or not very good for us developmentally, that occurred in early years, can somehow get stuck into our nervous system. And there's even books like The Body Keeps the Score. So literally, psychology's most highly selling book of all time, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, is the way they get around that. That's the sort of mental gymnastics they have to do to get around the obvious idiocy of such an argument. Okay, so you don't remember it, but it's stuck in your body, as if. Right, so that's my primary problem with attachment theory. Now, interestingly, Dad Saves America podcast is quite right of centre. In the comments section, it was one of the most popular videos that he's ever done, one of the most popular guests he's ever had, which is funny because most of the comments seem to be, yes, this supports everything I've ever believed, and presumably most of them seem to be stay-at-home mums and trad mums and things like that, which I wholeheartedly endorse. Problem is, I don't know if they realise where this movement is coming from. So yes, it's telling them what they want to hear, I suspect. And here's the thing about the attachment theory. It appeals to everyone. It's gold dust, PR-wise, for psychologists, because everyone loves it. Conservative stay-at-home mums, trad mums, people like that, get to say, oh yes, the moral strictures that I impart to my child, most especially the homeschooling I'm doing. And again, homeschooling, great, fantastic. I have nothing against it at all. May well be really advisable in a lot of places today. But they wrongly attribute the fact that what they input into their child during those years will be indelible, permanent, blueprint and foundation, if you like, that cannot be rocked. It absolutely can. It will be totally forgotten if the child went on a completely different trajectory. Hopefully they won't. But that 3 years itself is not relevant in your 20s for obvious reasons. And famously, lots of excellent parents, I see them all the time because I run a drug treatment centre, lots of parents have brought up their kids pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty well. And something else went wrong, which is called peer groups, or the environment, the wider environment outside of the family, society, and perhaps even genes. Now we can talk more about those shortly, but just hold that thought. It is patently, obviously, demonstrably the case that good parents who've tried really hard can often have the misfortune of having offspring that go off the rails, basically. So that's another, and what's more is quite common, and what's more with extremely strict moral upbringings, I would suggest is even more common, because the naturally defiant rebellious nature of children and teenagers does its thing, right? But to go back to the original point, on the other hand, liberals and progressives love this theory as well, because for several different reasons. Number one, it asserts that nurture is supreme over nature. We are blank slates. That's why your mother's amazing love wires up your brain, because you are completely blank before that. There is no nature, there's nothing there. Therefore, the parents, the secure base, the primary attachment figure, is inputting all the data and doing the wiring in the brain. If that's true, then a girl can be a boy and a boy can be a girl, and the only thing that matters is which toys do you give them, and you can create what you want, which obviously is very appealing to progressives. The blank slate, rabid nurturist theory of human development is extremely appealing to progressives. So now let's just say you're an ordinary person who did have an unhappy childhood. And this is actually the reason that I think is most problematic. It's most problematic to lean on attachment theory when you're coming from this angle. And this angle is, I'm unhappy, I'm an adult in my 20s or 30s, and I love this theory because it tells me that my parents are to blame. So even though they don't do it explicitly, I'd almost have more respect for them if they did. the neo-psychoanalytic woo that is attachment theory, childhood trauma model, call it what you will, is really essentially good old-fashioned mother bashing, good old-fashioned Freudian mother bashing. They, of course, don't mention mothers, they don't frame mothers specifically in that way because they are largely feminists, so they wouldn't do that. But obviously, that's what it essentially is, or in practical terms, that's what it becomes. Now that, again, is gold dust for psychotherapists because it creates dozens, hundreds of therapy sessions during which the aggrieved plaintiff comes in and accuses their parents, and the theory is there boxed up nicely on the side for the therapist to wield. Yes, it's an insecure attachment. Yes, they didn't give you what you needed in your early years, da 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 da. The fact is, that's not how it is. If you're in your 20s and 30s and you have issues, you may or may not have had a difficult upbringing. Your parents may or may not be nice, good people. But that's got nothing to do with it. It is now your issue. Okay? And self-knowledge, piling in more and more, digging in more and more and more to your childhood and what went wrong with the attachment is toothless. Let's face it, you already know what went wrong. And where has knowing that got you to this date? Not very far, because you're still looking for the answer. So to go in and dig more into the minutiae of what happened doesn't give you much. And psychoanalysts certainly cannot give you the techniques that you need to get out of that, because they are engaging a psychoanalysis, not behavioral analysis. They are analyzing your psychology, not your behavior. And the way that you're going to come out of that is to say, well, I'm an adult now. That wasn't good, but knowing that isn't going to get me anywhere. I now need to do something. Self-knowledge will not move you forward in terms of personal growth. Repetitively doing different behaviors will. And that is what we would call behavioral analysis, analyzing our behavior, and therapies like CBT, which, interestingly, the same guest threw under the bus towards the end of the interview, saying something along the lines of CBT and other such behavioral therapies lack the depth to really explore what's really wrong, e.g. in the first 3 years or childhood. Now, I'm not a CBT therapist, so I've got no particular axe to grind on that one. But to be honest, when you've got leading psychologists, very, very well-known and weighty psychologists like John Haidt, who wrote The Coddling for the American Mind, in which he said plainly, you know, it's becoming pretty obvious now that we don't need to waste money doing therapies that dig around endlessly in our childhood and talk endlessly about our childhood. That may feel good, and the therapist certainly enjoys it because you keep coming back, but you're not going to make a lot of progress. Cognitive behavioral therapies are more effective because they develop strategies, actions, behaviors, which will actually change things for you. Okay, so I'll do another video on that specifically and link it to this video. So to come back to what is it actually that's creating the dynamic, the finished product of you as an adult, if not your parents' parenting style and good quality attachments that they gave you? Well, a number of things. So where I go with that would be somewhere like Steven Pinker. And, you know, there's plenty I could disagree about with Steven Pinker and Dawkins and Harris and all those other thinkers. The utility of religion, for example, I would disagree heartily with them on that. But if you are running away with your hands over your eyes and ears because you don't want to hear something, because it doesn't accord with your belief, there's a problem. And I think that's what a lot of people would do with a video like this, for example. They'll hear that attachment disorder isn't true, or it's new age woo-woo, or something like that, and they don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear a potential other alternative, so they'll just turn off, and that's the problem. Now, Pinker challenges me a lot, as does Harris, as does Dawkins, but I listen to them because you can't not listen to epoch-defining, weighty thinkers like that and not take them seriously. Now, in his 2002 book, Blank Slate, Pinker goes into this in some detail, actually. So there's a chapter in there called Children, or something like that, where he recounts the work of Judith Harris, who's a heretical psychologist who suggested another theory called group socialization, whereby your peers actually have much more influence over you, especially in your teens, which, if you remember, Komisar described, the guest on the podcast described as one of the key critical periods of growth where parents are the architects of their children's brains. The exact opposite is probably the truth. It's much more your peers that are affecting you in your teens for obvious reasons, because you need to impress your peers as you move into the world of adults to gain opportunities in life, mating opportunities, financial opportunities. You need to develop your reputation. You need to move away from your parents at that point. You are totally disinterested in anything your parents think at that stage, usually, even if you're very well behaved. That will be the peak of your rebellion at that stage, away from your parents, right? And rightly so, because you have to develop yourself as a distinct individual. And the way that you're going to be successful in the world is through the pecking order of your peers, not anything to do with your parents. They are fast receding. Okay, so looked at from that angle, Pinker and Harris would say something like this. Imagine, well, a good example would be, take the immigrant experience. If you're a second generation young Indian woman in the UK, are you wearing a sari? Are you speaking Gujarati? Maybe, if you're very traditional and the family keep you close to the family home. But most likely, you are speaking English and wearing jeans. And you're moving towards the interests and obsessions of your peer group, not your parents. Likewise, say young, famously second, third generation Black British, say of Jamaican heritage, are not very similar to the first Windrush generation, who were very old-fashioned English, really, pro-royal family, very conservative, very church-going. That changed in the second and third generation as young Black British became much more like, including with all of the pathologies that entailed, much more like white British youth and other British youth. So the group socialization theory would say peers, certainly as childhood goes on, become much more influential on your personality development than your parents. But Pinker would point to, I think it was Harris pointed to the laws of behavioral genetics and things like that as to how we develop through human stages. So, for example, a behavioral trait behavioral traits are something that you have to consider when you're looking at the fully finished product of the adult. You have to consider it more than parenting style. A behavioral trait is something, all human behaviors for a start are heritable. And a behavioral trait is clearly, such as, for example, artistic temperament, having a hot temper, something like that. These things are stable, not particularly malleable. You can work on them a bit, you can smooth off the bad ones and increase the ones that you need more of, but in general, they're pretty solid throughout the lifetime. They're inherited from parents or other progenitors, and behavioral traits are at least as much, and probably significantly more, to do with what makes you the finished adult, the finished product adult, than any particular parenting style that your parents employed, much less what they did when you were 2 years old. Okay, so the behavioral traits trump parenting style. As if to sort of prove this, twins brought up in different communities, separated at birth and brought up in different places, are almost always extremely similar. And psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, blank slate theorists hate twin studies for this reason. And the fact that they hate it so much is a bit of a clue, really. It's pretty damn obvious that if you separate two twins at birth and they grow up in different places and they're exactly the same, then it is showing you that genes are incredibly powerful and more powerful than parenting style. And then thirdly, you've got to consider that a significant amount of the various human behaviors are not informed by genes, are not informed by family or parenting style at least. They are formed by a third thing, which is the overall environment, the world, your unique experiences, things like that. So I might have a much more difficult time than my brother because I go to a difficult school, even though we're brought up by the same parents, right? So that is another angle on the things that are much more likely to produce you, and indeed your psychopathologies or problems that you have as an adult that aren't some nutty theory about how much your mummy loved you when you were 2 and that wired up your brain rightly or wrongly. That stuff is, well, number one, icky. I mean, can you imagine if it were actually true? The only reason you're a functional human is because your mummy loved you in exactly the right way. I mean, who wants to sign up for that? It's not true. People from very adverse backgrounds go on to lead wonderful lives, and people who were attended to enormously and endlessly as infants go on to be completely problematic and have terrible psychopathologies, right? It is just neo-Freudian woo-woo dressed up with epigenetics and all sorts of other pseudoscience that they tag inappropriately onto the theory to try and give it some legitimacy. In reality, it is quite heavily political, and people don't seem to spot it. They don't see that this is blank slateism, and therefore potentially gender denying, gender role denying, and things like that. That is its primary usefulness for people who are activists, is to say, look, you develop according to attachment theory because you're a blank slate. That means that nurture is predominant and preeminent in human development, and it just isn't. Nature has a much more significant role, and analysing your behaviours rather than endlessly psychologically analysing yourself is going to be more profitable for your personal growth, because the only way you're going to change is through changing your behaviours. You can't think your way out of a problem. You can't analyse your childhood out of a problem. You can't work your way out of a problem by analysing your childhood. All that happens is you find more and more things to be angry about. It doesn't get you anywhere ultimately. A basic understanding of what happened and a truthful recounting of that to any helping professional that's working with you obviously is helpful for them to map out who you are and where you come from. But pretty quickly you're going to proceed to solution-oriented thinking, trying to find a way of moving forward. And that is almost certainly going to be along the lines of, well, I am an adult. These are now effectively my problems, regardless of whether my parents were very helpful in that or not. I am the one who's stuck with the problem, and I am indeed the one who's going to have to solve it. Them being wrong doesn't help me. Right, so then you are actually in the realms of things like CBT, which I will go into in more depth, hopefully in the next video.